Hello, my name is James Fitzgerald, and today I'll be telling you about using mindfulness activities to promote psychological flexibility in children. This is a partial requirement for my master's thesis at Southern Illinois University, Behavior Analysis and Therapy Department in spring 2020. So today what we'll start with is a brief overview of the intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, the costs associated, and the treatments available. So intellectual and developmental disabilities are a group of developmental conditions characterized by significant impairment of cognitive functions which are associated with limitations of learning, adaptive behavior, and skills. Most of these skills are ones that are useful for everyday essential life skills, behavioral, physical, ability to process things neurologically in order to complete your proper actions. So the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities considers these developmental disabilities an umbrella term that includes things that will significantly limit both intellectual functioning, reasoning, learning, problem solving, and a variety of other affected areas. It also includes other disabilities apparent from childhood. So these developmental disabilities can be cognitive, physical, or both, and they are usually lifelong. Treatments for neurological disorders vary greatly from those that may be necessary in disorders that are physical in nature, and there are many behavioral strategies that aim to reduce problematic behavior, increase the rates of skill acquisition, and allow for an overall better quality of life for the individuals that are affected by these pervasive developmental disorders. So developmental disability prevalence is not only an ongoing challenge for those affected, but it will increase to even more communities in the future as the rate of disability is high and increasing. One neurodevelopmental disability that is increasing in prevalence at the highest rate of diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder, or as I might refer to it a little bit in this presentation, would be ASD. This is a disorder defined by marked impairments in social communication, social interaction, and the presence of restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. It's marked by certain behavioral excesses and deficits, including difficulty with communication, interaction with other people, restricted interests, repetitive behaviors, symptoms that hurt the person's ability to function properly in school, work, or possibly even other areas in life. So there have been substantial increases in the United States since the 1990s of diagnoses of autism. It's not just due to the testing being completed, though, or the understanding of the disorder, but it's also the awareness that has risen in the recent years. So many diagnosed with autism require lifelong care and support across numerous fields such as education, healthcare, and community services. Unfortunately, these costs are not just attributed to financial costs, but it's also the time that is placed into the treatment for the individual, both by parents, caretakers, like we said before, the school system, private events, private insurance, sorry, lots of things that are just more or less a little bit difficult to deal with. Not only the financial costs and the time costs, but the stress that is placed upon these parents and caretakers is also significant. So in an attempt to reduce some of the challenges associated with ASD, evidence-based therapies have been used to reduce problem behaviors and teach functional principles. Discrete child training, ABA, a variety of other ones are also I would say, typical treatments for autism. However, there is always a need for new and improving skills. Sorry. So the last 20 years of research have demonstrated both methods for identifying ASD and methods for improving the outcomes of these children. What we will look at today is another blossoming treatment. So we'll go over a little bit of background information here as well regarding psychological flexibility, mindfulness, and relational frame theory. So we'll actually start at the bottom there and talk about RFT. Relational frame theory is a functional contextual approach to human language and cognition that has relevant implications for psychological interventions. So RFT is actually what funnels down into psychological flexibility and mindfulness. There are 6 components of acceptance and commitment therapy, which acceptance and commitment therapy is derived from RFT, and each component can contribute to the manipulation of choice making. Components described visually to exist as a hexagon, and they all interact with one another and based on the notion that individuals engage in experiential avoidance, which leads them to undesirable behaviors. So these 6 are cognitive diffusion, acceptance, contact with the present moment, observing the self, values, and committed action. And what we will be focusing on today is present moment awareness, also known as mindfulness. So mindfulness is a form of present moment awareness. Mindfulness-based therapies are generally effective in reducing anxiety, stress, and depressive symptoms in adults. These combination of mindfulness and acceptance commitment therapy differs from traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. So rather than trying to teach people how to control their thoughts and feelings, it teaches people to notice, accept, embrace them, including their previously unwanted ones. By awakening present moment awareness through mindfulness, individuals fuse less with their thoughts and act towards acceptance of distress. So acceptance is the key to using mindfulness, to accept your thought for what they are rather than pushing them away. So there have been past studies that have confirmed the effectiveness of acceptance and commitment therapy. I will go ahead and start calling it ACT from now on, showing differences in experimental versus controlled groups and reduction of anxiety and depression. There have been studies as well that reported that mindfulness exercise placed them in the present moment, which in turn facilitated attentional focus and reduced distracting thoughts. And mindfulness meditation has also been shown to increase people's present moment awareness, which changes their relationships to not only the present, from entwined and critical to separated and non-judgmental. So a little bit of diffusion in there as well. So some other studies also show increasing elements of psychological flexibility using ACT. They have been shown to reduce inflexible behaviors, which aren't necessarily maladaptive, but typically they will be. So although all these direct interventions focus on applying mindfulness techniques onto mostly an adult population, there is also a lot of RFT, ACT, and mindfulness studies that have been done on the caretakers of those with autism spectrum disorder, but not too many have actually directly focused on those younger people in the population who may benefit from it. So the current, so the purpose of this study, we will go over the usefulness of ACT, the mindfulness activities themselves that we will be implementing, how they will increase learner attending and reduce problem behaviors. So the current study aimed to explore these possibilities with regard to the impact of mindfulness on maladaptive behavior levels, as well as participant pre- and post-test scores on the Children's Psychological Flexibility Scale, which will be referred to as the CPFQ from now on. The level of participant behavior was measured in the baseline phase, along with their psychological flexibility levels as the control. So based on previous literature, it was predicted that mindfulness would reduce maladaptive behavior, as well as improve psychological flexibility in the clients. So the purpose of the current study overall is to examine the usefulness of ACT and mindfulness activities in helping to increase learner attending and behavior reduction, as measured by the behavior, by observed learner behavior and questionnaires. So there's a clear need for the establishment of the effective empirically supported behavioral interventions for ASD and increased psychological flexibility. And there are strong theoretical reasons for exploring the application of mindfulness in the treatment of those cognitive processes. Present moment awareness is highly relevant to the treatment of anxiety and rumination, as conceptualization of these constructs and mechanisms of experiential avoidance are ideally consistent with acceptance and commitment model. Finally, mindfulness encompasses a number of the therapeutic components which individually have been established to be effective in increasing psychological flexibility, as well as other related variables. We will touch a little bit on what I just mentioned too about anxiety too, because as we go over the participants right now, you will see that all of them do not just have a sole diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So to our participants, so all of our participants were between the ages of 4 and 10. There were 3 participants. The diagnostic criteria was designated by the formal diagnosis of ASD by a qualified professional, obviously. And efforts were made to recruit participants within a specified treatment program within a single site. So they were recruited based on ACT recommendations by the site owners themselves, who are also board certified behavioral analysts that were assigned to each case. So inclusion criteria, all clients needed to be enrolled in a special education program or a therapeutic day program that has provided agency consent. So in this case, it was in-home ABA therapy. They'd need to demonstrate deficits in social communication skills, anxiety, or antisocial behaviors as evidenced by the inclusion of communication goals of their IEP. So goals or the summary of the treatment plan were expressed in advance to the parents of potential subjects before continuing with a formal introduction, consents, and all the other releases. we'll move on to the actual individual participants themselves for time's sake. So my first participant, there were 3 participants total, 100% of them were male. Participant 1 was age 7 at the start of the baseline for mindfulness study, had a formal diagnosis of pervasive neurodevelopmental disorder, autism spectrum disorder, organic lability of mood with significant obsessive compulsive features, central auditory processing disorder, multiple forms of dyslexia, reading and writing and math skills, and chronic sleep difficulty. So the particular behaviors of concern exerted by this participant were noncompliance, physical aggression, verbal aggression, and elopement. Client had a history of difficulty complying within learning environments, as well as presence of maladaptive behaviors, particularly within the presence of non-preferred stimuli or the presentation of learning materials or verbiage. Top of the maladaptive behaviors that were being tracked for the purpose of the study, client also exerted behaviors that would not be categorized as maladaptive, but were related to the symptoms of anxiety, so a little bit more of restlessness. Participant 2 was age 6 at the start of baseline for the mindfulness study, had a formal diagnosis of ASD, as well as generalized refractory epilepsy and ADHD combined type. Particular behaviors of concern exerted by participant 2 were noncompliance, verbal aggression, property destruction, physical aggression. This client did not necessarily struggle with instructional control or compliance within learning environments. However, complying to tasks or demands placed in novel situations or non-preferred situations evoked a little bit more maladaptive behaviors. So less of a control issue and more of just a frustration type reaction. Participant 3 was age 5 at the start of baseline of the mindfulness study, had a formal diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. So the particular behaviors of concern exerted by participant 3 occurred at a much lower rate than participants 1 and 2. The ones that we did see were more whining, crying, non-compliance, anxiety-driven type behaviors though, mostly caused by a change of schedule, presence of non-preferred stimuli, or recall of events that evoked anxiety in the past. He was also known for contriving situations in which anxiety would be amplified, which was hypothesized to gain attention. So we already went over our participants and individual histories. We'll look at a little bit now. We went over their diagnoses. We'll go over the settings. So the settings were in each client's own home where ABA therapy was typically administered. There were no changes to the environment other than before running any mindfulness activities. We made sure that we were more or less isolated from others. There was no distractions in the room, and they were ran at the beginning 10 minutes of each session. So it was a concurrent multiple baseline design across participants. Mindfulness activities were effective in behavior reduction as well as psychological flexibility. They were assessed at baseline and treatment intervals. So treatment sessions were applied as often as possible each week across participants on a concurrent schedule. We measured the same behaviors across participants just to make it universally a little more even, which were aggression, elopement, property destructions, and all behaviors were operationally defined to encompass all participants involved in the study. We did administer the CPFQ and began with a baseline stage, which quantitative behavioral data was collected by a trained therapist, and following baseline, participants attended the regular scheduled ABA sessions with the added variable of mindfulness activities. At the conclusion of the intervention phase, CPFQ was repeated for the comparison to the pre-intervention scores, and the data was then graphed for visual analysis, and comparisons of baseline to intervention phases were compared between individuals to determine significance of behavioral change based on intervention. The therapists for implementation, there was one individual therapist, which was the primary researcher, myself, involved in the intervention application. Each client involved in the study had one or more BCBAs already assigned to their case, as well as multiple RBTs who administered ABA treatment, but a singular therapist was assigned to administer the mindfulness interventions, who was also an RBT, who was trained and experienced in delivering ACT activities. Therefore, although ABA treatment was consistently delivered by separate therapists, mindfulness treatment was not. Every session, I should say. The RBT administering ACT was also enrolled in a graduate program at SIU for behavioral analysis and therapy. Okay, now we'll look at a little bit of the intervention process itself. So treatment was administered in-person intervention preceding the ABA services in the client's home. Like I mentioned before, typically within the first 10 minutes, well, it was always in the first 10 minutes of session. However, sometimes it would only take a couple minutes. Very rarely did it take the entire 10 minutes. So the duration of the intervention sessions was 10 minutes, using multiple sessions per week, aiming for 2 to 3 sessions per week. There were a few weeks where there was only 0 to 1 administered. Siblings or other individuals were removed from the treatment area. So the component of ACT targeted was the present moment's awareness. Present moment's awareness focused on contacting what is happening in the present moment rather than experienced in the past. So 25 treatment sessions were planned. If adequate reductions in measured behavior was not observed at the end of the final session, participants were given the option to be given additional sessions if requested by the client directly themselves. It was a flexible approach taken just due to the varied numbers and length of sessions shown to be sufficient for adult populations. Excuse me. And let's see, we'll go to our pre and post measure. We did baseline behavior data, and we did the pre-test for the CPFQ. Follow-up on the entire study was terminated at the end of the intervention. Follow-up data was not necessarily collected, nor will it be to this date. No dangers or threats to mental health were posed at the concept of the study, so there was no testing needed at the end. Here we go. Here is the fun part. We have our results. Here I figured it would be easiest to just display all of these on one slide. I'm hoping that computer screens are large enough to enhance that a little bit. And we will start actually with the graph on the right. So participants' behavior data at baseline and follow-up are presented there in figure 1, where you can see average weekly rate of maladaptive behaviors. So as you can see for participant 1, right on top there, maladaptive behaviors decreased from baseline to post-intervention. During baseline, their problematic behavior occurred about 19.4 times per session. Post-intervention was at 15.2, which was an overall change of 21.7%. So now if we look at the PND for that same percentage of non-overlapping data, that'll be all the way to your left there. You can see for that same participant, participant 1, that, PND ranges from 0 to 100%. So the results for participant 1 showed the lowest phase A data point as 4, and 4 of the 20 data points in the intervention phase are below it, so their PND score was 20%. And a third analysis that was ran here is PEM. So PEM was the percentage of data points exceeding the midline. They had a PEM score for participant 1 of 65% improvement over median baseline. And there was one additional analysis ran, which I didn't put the graph on here, but we did run ANCOVAs. So the ANCOVA test was done in order to measure significance of the intervention, which led results of the treatment phase outcomes. The variables measured in the ANCOVA were condition, which was baseline versus treatment, as the independent variable, and rate as the dependent variable. Outcomes of the ANCOVA ran on participant 1 showed a significance level of P equals 0.367, which were determined to be insignificant, where significance was measured as P is less than 0.05. So now we'll move down one section here, back on the same page, and we will look at participant 2. We'll start over here on the right. Participant 2, maladaptive behaviors also decrease, from baseline to post-intervention. So during baseline, problematic behaviors occurred an average of 17 times per session, and post-intervention showed an average rate of 12.5 times per session, which was an overall change of 26.5%. Excuse me. These were all positive behavior changes. As you can see now, their PND results over here in figure 2. Oops, excuse me. Sorry about that. So the PND results over here in figure 2 show, I believe it's, 7 out of 19, which is 34%. And our PEM analysis over here is 14 out of 19 of the data points were below the median, leading to results of 74%. So the ANCOVA for participant 2 showed P equals 0.167, where these results were also determined to be considered insignificant, where significance was measured less than 0.05. So once again, both of these past participants that we just discussed, both did show positive behavioral changes. However, when it came to significance, it was not shown by the ANCOVA to be statistically significant. Now we'll go over our third participant, participant 3. So once again, their behavior decreased from baseline to intervention. Baseline was 2.8 per session, and post-intervention showed 1.6 average times per session, which was a change of 43.9% positive behavioral change. So a visual representation of the observed behavior could be shown right there. We also did our percentage of non-overlap data over here. As you can see, because their lowest base point was 0, already made it a little bit difficult to see a change in that, because obviously you cannot score less than 0, but their P&D score for that was 0.24, I believe. Yes, it was. And then as our third analysis here, our PEM, percentage of data points exceeding the median, they had 14 out of 17 below the median, leading to an 82%. The ANCOVA results for this participant actually did show P equals 0.049, which in fact did show statistical significance, meaning that the treatment was responsible for the behavioral changes observed in participant 3. So overall, there was a general trend of reduced problematic behavior from baseline to post-intervention. Participants' behavioral frequency rates averaged 13.1 per session during baseline, and an average score of 9.8 per session post-intervention. So an overall average reduction of 25.2%. So, oh, sorry, I meant to discuss it here as well. But as you can see, I just posted a small table here just for visual analysis. The CPFQ scores, the Children's Psychological Flexibility Questionnaire for participant 1, 2, and 3. Here are their pre-scores. As you can see, all scores did increase across these. Average scores pre-session or pre-intervention were 54.7, and post-intervention were 62 per session, so an average improvement of 11.8%. Okay, now we will take a look at our brief discussion here. So the results of the study showed that after participating in mindfulness activities using a standardized procedure, participants displayed decreases in problematic behavior and increases in psychological flexibility, which was in fact the goal of the study. All 3 participants displayed these decreases in behavior and increases in the CPFQ. However, participant 3 was the only one that showed statistically significant results based on the analysis of the covariant, or the ANCOVA, inferring that the treatment had positive significance in behavioral change for this individual. Standardized measure of behavior in the child was consistent with the intervention purpose of increasing mindfulness techniques in order to promote more independent coping and acceptance skills. In relation to other studies, the results of this study do support the literature, supporting mindfulness, meditation, and other present moment exercises. Supports the idea of mindfulness not only increasing people's present moment awareness, but also had a positive effect on maladaptive behaviors. The CPFQ results from the current study also support that the intervention could be effective for increasing elements of psychological flexibility and mindfulness. So in general, the use of these mindfulness activities at the start of learning sessions were a successful way of teaching clients and can be a factor in producing behavior change in children, behavioral learning deficits, and the use of the multiple baseline design across participants, showed, sorry about that, and showed the individualized mindfulness endeavor was able to produce consistent outcomes across the 3 participants. So in all 3 participants, we did see positive behavioral change and increase in the CPFQ. So it is important to look at some of the limitations of this study, and these were very highly sought after in here. I really wanted to find out the direct limitations. Some of them popped straight out. Biggest limitation, one of the largest limitations that I personally saw in this, was the fact that I was the sole therapist implementing this treatment. So not only would this possibly be associated with just myself, my personality, my relationship with these clients, but also there was no generalization across therapists. I also think a limitation of this could possibly be the setting itself. Yes, we did run it at home in their own environment, but there's also no generality for other environments. Excuse me. First, another concern was that the CPFQ was adapted to each client, which was an option, but although each client was able to respond to the questionnaire with an appropriate numerical answer, the understanding of what was expected varied a little bit across participants. Each client received a breakdown of each possible response after asking each question. However, with the variance in age and the comprehensive understanding, as well as the attending of what was required. The accuracy of the responding seemed to be a little bit variable. I had some clients who like to pick, seemed to lean a lot more towards the nevers, and some that leaned a little bit more towards all the times, even though from a third party, they did not seem 100% accurate at times. Another limitation to the present study was the length of time that the study took place. So originally it was proposed that the implementation portion of the study would take approximately 2 months, based on 2 sessions per week. However, due to the session allowances and scheduling, participants' ABA schedules, it took approximately 6 months to complete the data collection. They were not set on a set day or days each week. So this relates a little bit to the maturation of the client as well as the change in overall their life environment. When we did start the study, it was December, and then there was obviously a break for school into January, which was expected. And then because it continued, the study actually did not complete until the summer after that school year. So future research could look at a little bit more, maybe parental training and parents implementing it. Sorry. It could compare behavior data post-intervention to current in order to maintain the skills. I would like to do a little bit of follow-up at some point, which I might personally just look at myself, not for the purpose of this study. So this is a necessary direction I think research should take, so we can confirm with greater certainty that the intervention is possible to make positive behavior changes. So a final component I'd like to go over for future research would be to take into consideration the maintenance of the outcomes, which is kind of what I just mentioned a little bit. But the study did not have any maintenance protocol built in, and due to this, the true lasting effect of the mindfulness activities does not have any resonance. It would be interesting to look at the implementation over a broader community as well, different ages, genders, diagnoses. I think this would provide data on how participant behavior may vary across demographics a little bit, whether the modification to the implementation protocol could be adapted to different populations. Just a little bit of tweaking here and there just to see what works best for everyone. So in conclusion, the study did show that mindfulness exercises could be used successfully to promote psychological flexibility and reduce problem behaviors in children with autism diagnoses. The use of multiple baseline across participants provides strong results, while consistent outcomes were achieved across all participants. Also, participants were very subjective to changing school schedules, summer breaks, adverse events due to siblings present during the duration of the study. Further research needs to look at a little bit more follow-up protocols, long-term properties on behavior, so we can accurately say the use of mindfulness activities in children can be effective. Thank you very much. I am looking forward to seeing more of this research in the future. Thank you.